Matt, so glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you're watching this message. We are almost through our series, The Acts of the Jewish Apostles. We find ourselves near the end here of the book of Acts. And as we do in the beginning of each message of this series, we look at Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and throughout Judah, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. And of course, that's the whole pattern of the book of Acts. The gospel first goes to Jerusalem, to Hebrew-speaking, Aramaic-speaking Jews, then to Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem, then to Greek-speaking Jews in Judah and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And we find Paul almost to Rome, where he has to defend himself in Caesarea. Will spend 2 years in prison in Caesarea after this speech, and then will end up in Rome in the end of the earth preaching the gospel. And so today's message in Acts chapter 24 is called the hope of the resurrection. In the last few chapters, in 21, Paul, and 22, Paul finds himself in Jerusalem for the festival of Shavuot. And there's a riot because of gossip and slander against things that he's not doing, that the leaders who are against him are saying he is doing by desecrating the temple and bringing a Gentile into a part of the temple they're not supposed to go, which Paul doesn't do. And we find Paul in chapter 22 and 23 challenging the authorities of both Jerusalem and Rome. And last week in chapter 23, we asked the question, what does love require of me? And how to be people of love even in the face of adversity in our relationships. And today, we look at the hope of the resurrection, the reason why Paul was in trouble, the reason why Paul was preaching. It says in Acts 24 and verse 1 that after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney named Tertullius and brought formal charges against Paul before the governor. Now, Tertullius, we don't know a whole lot about, but many commentators assume that he's a Hellenistic Jew, a lawyer who has expertise in the affairs of the empire. And of course, as lawyers normally would for a judge, Tertullius first flatters the governor Felix with things that are absolutely not true about the governor Felix, of the leader, appointed governor from Rome over Judea. And it says in verse 2, Acts 24 and verse 2, it says, when Paul was called in, Tertullius began to accuse him, saying, we are enjoying much peace through you and reforms introduced for this nation because of your foresight. And we acknowledge this, most excellent Felix, in every way and in every place with all gratitude. Of course, those comments are the opposite of what we know of Felix historically from sources even outside of the New Testament and in Roman sources. And that as we talk about the hope of the resurrection, we have to talk about who Felix is. Felix was a slave who was freed by Antonia, named after, the place that the Romans, their fortification outside the temple courts, called the Fortress Antonia, after Antonia, the mother of the Emperor Claudius. And Felix's brother, Pallas, was also a freed slave who was good friends with the Emperor Claudius. And so Felix, because of his relationship as a freed slave and a Roman citizen who probably purchased his citizenship, Felix was appointed in 48 to a government job in Samaria. Then in 52, Claudius makes Felix the governor over Judea. And in his last few years last few days, years, because he holds Paul in prison for 2 years, we see him interacting with Paul. And as governor, there were all kinds of insurrections and anarchy that increased in Judea, which he would put down with cruelty and harsh punishment. And his cruelty alienated the Jewish people and led to even further disturbances. And we know that the Jewish leaders, that their issue with Paul was a matter of disagreement on the Torah and the supposed resurrection of Yeshua. But their presentation, first with all the flattery of all the things opposite of what Felix was doing, really has three charges. The first two are political sedition, that he disturbed the peace as a ringleader of the Nazarenes. And the third is that he defiled the temple, an accusation of bringing a Gentile into the temple courts. Now, Felix is known historically for crucifying leaders of uprisings and their followers for threatening peace of the Roman Empire. So, of course, the irony of all of this is the accusations that Tertullius and the leaders who are against Paul are making are really the things that they have done. Because Paul did not defile the temple. He did nothing against the temple. But they, as we looked at last week, were willing to kill Paul in or around the temple courts, from the Fortress Antonia to the Hall of Hewn Stone, where the Sanhedrin would meet. A clear defilement of the temple and of breaking the Torah in a variety of ways. So Tertullius presents his case, which makes Paul into this insurrectionist against Rome before a Roman governor, and very similar, in fact, to the bogus charges made against Yeshua himself in Luke chapter 23. So in verse 9, verse 5 of Acts 24, Tertullius continues, said, "Look, we found this man to be a pest, stirring up riots among the Jewish people throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to defile the temple, but we seized him. And by examining him yourself, O good Felix, you will be able to learn from him all these things about which we accuse him." And the Judean leaders, this group of 40 from the earlier chapter, also joined in the attack, affirming that these things were true. Of course, they're not true. And these 40 members of the Sanhedrin who tried to murder Paul in the temple courts continue their lies and slander against Paul here in a trial before the Roman governor Felix. And everything that Paul deals with, and has said several times in Acts, and now here in the last few speeches in the end of Acts, is all about the hope of the resurrection. See, the accusation was that Paul was stirring up riots everywhere, and that Paul was this ringleader of these Nazarenes who were causing riots everywhere, and that Paul tried to defile the temple. And they, the leaders like them, were actually the ones who stirred up the riots throughout the world, in Corinth and in Thessalonica and in Ephesus. And even some of those same leaders from Ephesus are then the ones who stir up a riot in Jerusalem during the festival of Shavuot. And though Paul did not defile the temple, they did by trying to have him murdered there. In fact, the Acts tells us that he purified himself at the temple, and he paid for the purification of other Jewish people at the temple. And well, of course, he is a leader of this group that they call themselves the Way. They never call themselves Nazarenes. They never call themselves Christians. Those are names that they are called by outsiders, but they call themselves followers of the Way. And finally, here in Acts 24, Paul gets his chance. You remember the last time that Paul appeared before a Roman governor was in Acts 18, 7 years before, in the year 51. And Gallio did not allow Paul to speak or to defend himself. So here, Felix gives Paul the moment he's been waiting for. But I think it's important, before we get into Paul's brilliant defense, and it is brilliant, before the governor Felix, I want to jump to the end of chapter 24 for more context regarding Felix. Because Luke tells us that Felix had an extensive knowledge of the followers of the Way. And after Paul's speech, they spent time together so he could hear more about Yeshua. So we jump to the end after the speech, and then we're going to go back and look at Paul's speech again. But verse 24 gives us more context. It says, "Now some days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. And he sent for Paul and listened to him speak about faith in Messiah Yeshua." Now, this is where it gets salacious. Drusilla is actually Felix's third wife, and she's the youngest daughter of Agrippa I, who is the one who killed James, the son of Zebedee, in Acts chapter 12. And as the story goes, Drusilla left her husband, Azizus, the king of Emesa, to be with Felix. And Felix thought she was so beautiful that he enticed her to leave her husband and come and marry him. Now, Drusilla, as Agrippa the first, her father, is the great granddaughter of Herod. And they were regarded by some as Jewish and not legitimately Jewish by others because of their heritage and the evil that they lived. In fact, her brother Agrippa II is married to their sister Bernice. We're going to see them in the next chapter in Acts 25. What a family they are. And remember that Felix was a slave that was set free and then put in power because of his brother's relationship with the emperor. And they are both, Felix and Drusilla, known in Roman history as power-hungry, do anything to get to the top people. So Paul is teaching them about faith in Yeshua, and he says, Luke writes in verse 25, but Paul was arguing about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. And Felix became afraid and said, "Go away for now, and when I find time, I will summon you." Why does Felix become so afraid when Paul is talking about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment? Well, because the governor and his wife, Jewish people, knowing what they were supposed to do, but instead aligning themselves with Rome, they are sort of interested in Yeshua, and all, as the ruler of the area, certainly knew the story of Yeshua and had heard about the followers of the way, probably interacted with some of them, as their father even killed some of the original followers of Yeshua. They had heard stories from Herod and from Agrippa I, but when Paul preaches to them about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, they become afraid. Why? Because they are living in unrighteousness. They have no self-control because she left her husband to be with Felix for no apparent reason except that she was unhappy and he thought she was beautiful. And there's judgment, as they know, as Jewish people, that there's coming judgment from God when Jewish people don't live the way we're supposed to live. And of course their response is, well, that's nice, but we're not really interested. But yet they keep meeting with Paul. And in verse 26, Luke tells us the reason why. It was because at the same time, Felix was hoping that money would be given to him by Paul. So he sent for him frequently and would talk with him. See, Felix was hoping Paul would pay him off, that Paul would give him a bribe. And of course, according to the Torah, we also know that Ananias the high priest was known historically for taking bribes and stealing from the temple, the tithes of the temple. And so Paul is being accused, and this is where it's important, across the board. Ananias the high priest and Felix and Drusilla and everybody involved, that Paul is being accused by people who should know better, but don't do what they are supposed to do. And he finds himself defending himself. He finds himself having to offer a defense before people who know better and don't do what they are supposed to do. So when we understand that about Felix and Drusilla, and we jump back then to Paul's speech, his defense before the governor Felix, and in front of the leaders of the Sanhedrin, these 40 people that were trying to murder him and didn't really care about the truth, with this lawyer who's also probably a Hellenistic Jew, who's accusing Paul of things he did not do. Paul, as we know Paul to do throughout the whole rest of the book of Acts, he does not shrink back because he trusts that God's in control. And he speaks with his typical brilliance as one who understands both the Torah and Roman law and is ready to face whatever he needs to face, to have the opportunity to preach the gospel, to talk about the death and the resurrection of Yeshua, even to Rome. And so Paul takes his shot. We jump a few verses back to verse 10, when Paul offers his defense. It says, when the governor nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, saying, "Knowing that you have been judge over this nation for many years, I gladly make my own defense." It's funny where Tertullius, the lawyer, gives all kinds of flattery and pleasantries and the opposite of what we know to be true of Felix. Paul just said, look, I know you've been in charge for a long time, 10 years. And that's all Paul says, because all that Paul says is true without any lie. And he says, you've been a judge over this nation for many years. And because Felix had been ruling in the area for over 10 years, was married to a Jewish woman, he had a knowledge of the people and the leaders and the system. Felix had context for the things that Paul was about to say. Paul says to him, as you can verify, it was no more 12 days than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. You remember back in chapter 21, it was probably Shavuot that the reason why Paul was in Jerusalem, as well as why leaders from Ephesus, who accused him of Ephesus and started riots there, were also in Jerusalem. And it was only 12 days since then, 5 of those days he'd been in jail, which means he was only in Jerusalem for 1 week. Now they're in Caesarea because they had to escape. And 1 week's not enough to incite a revolution against Rome. 1 week's not enough for the due process of the accusations according to the Torah, which these leaders ignore. And so Paul says, look, it's only been 12 days since any of this even happened, and half of which I've been here in prison in Caesarea waiting for you. And they did not find me arguing with anyone or inciting a riot, not in the temple or in synagogues or anywhere else in Jerusalem. Now, can they prove to you the charges they now bring against me? Of course, the answer is no. They have no proof. They have no proof because they were the ones who incited the riot. And they don't have any real charges against them except for these trumped-up charges of insurrection against Rome, which Paul has never done and never would do as a Roman citizen. So he says in verse 14 to Felix, he says, this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything written in the Torah and the prophets. It's fascinating because so should Ananias, and so should the other 39 leaders that were there breaking the Torah. So should Felix and Drusilla, and everyone involved in this trial. That everyone Jewish would know that we're supposed to worship the God of our fathers and believe everything written in the Torah and the prophets, like you shouldn't steal your wife from somebody else and your brother and sister shouldn't be married to each other. In so many theological perspectives, Paul is just made out to be a liar. He's represented as one who worships a different God from the God of Israel and one who has been set free from the Torah and the prophets, but in his own words. And he will again in Acts 26, we'll get there next week, before another Roman governor. He says he's done nothing against the Torah and nothing against the temple or nothing against Rome. Yet he is regarded even today and his own words twisted to make it sound like he's changed everything that God commanded Israel in the person of Yeshua because of his death and resurrection. When in reality, Paul is saying, look, in light of Yeshua's death and resurrection, because of the hope of the resurrection, I now understand more than ever Moses and the Torah and the temple and Israel's relationship to God, that we're supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. He says on trial before Gentiles. And the gospel is to be preached in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, which he has done. And now he's about to soon find himself in the ends of the earth, in Rome itself, preaching to Gentiles. So Paul says in verse 15, he says, look, in God I have hope, which these men also wait for, that there will surely be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience before God and men. See, Paul's saying, look, the only thing that I'm on trial for, he said it before the Sanhedrin, the only thing that I'm on trial for is for the hope of the resurrection. And the hope of the resurrection has always been a part of Jewish faith. This is true for Messianic Judaism today, for Messianic Jews like myself, because we believe in the God of our fathers. We believe in the covenants that God made with our fathers. We believe in everything that is in the Torah and the prophets. And the major disagreement is on the resurrection of Yeshua, whether it happened or it didn't happen, and whether it even matters. And to this day, people will say things like, look, you're not Jewish if you believe in Jesus. You're a Christian now, and Christians are not Jewish. But of course, no one in the New Testament ever says words like that. Because even the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the first temple, even Rome itself, saw Messianic Jews as a sect of Judaism, not a different religion. That doesn't happen for at least another 60 years after Paul dies. That Jewish followers of Yeshua were still considered by the whole Jewish world and by Rome itself for the rest of the first century as part of the Jewish people. And so Paul recounts what happened for Felix. He says in verse 17, look, going back to Acts 21, he says, now after several years, I came to bring a tzedakah, like charity, to my country for the poor and to present offerings. Remember, when Paul left Ephesus, he had collected in Corinth and Thessalonica and Philippi and Ephesus. He had made this collected an offering from the Gentile congregations that he had established, and because they wanted to bless the Jewish people in Jerusalem, the poor of the Jewish people from where the gospel first came. They wanted to bless the original preachers of the gospel and hearers of the gospel with this offering, and it's why Paul, on his way to Shavuot, brings this offering to the temple, and as he's bringing this offering for the poor, a riot is started because of gossip and slander. And he wanted to give back from the Gentiles who had come to faith in Yeshua to the place where the gospel first came from. And he says, I was doing this, and they found me in the temple, having been purified. Meaning, Paul didn't do anything against the temple. In fact, he went through the process of purification that everyone else would go through when you go to visit the temple, without crowd and without any uproar. He not only purified himself, but a few others who had made vows according to the Torah that Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, said, well, there are Jewish people that are saying that you're telling Jews to no longer keep the Torah, so pay for these vows for these men and purify yourself, which Paul does to prove the point. But of course, his opponents don't believe him. And commentators even today don't believe that Paul was being genuine, that he was just doing it to appease people. Let me ask you a question. In the story of Paul, when did Paul ever do anything just to appease people? Never. And he says there were men, there were some Jewish people from Asia, really from Ephesus, who ought to be here before you press charges if they have anything against me. As in, the people who started the riot, who created this whole thing and are accusing me of insurrection against Rome, they're not even here to lay out their charges against me because their charges aren't even true and they're false. And these leaders from Ephesus, who were the ones that started a riot because seeing Paul with Trophimus, a Gentile follower of Yeshua in the city, they assumed that he brought him into the temple, which Luke is clear to say he did not, and his original accusers aren't even there for the trial, and everything he did, everything Paul has done, according to Luke and in Paul's own words, were according to the Torah, and the accusations are unfounded without any evidence. So he says in verse 20, or let these men themselves, the Sanhedrin, tell you what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the Sanhedrin, because there wasn't any. Remember, he yells out, I'm only on trial because of the resurrection, the hope of the resurrection, before the Sanhedrin. And the Sadducees are the ones who get upset because they don't believe in the resurrection. And those among the Pharisees say, well, we believe in the resurrection too. We don't see anything wrong with what this man is doing. And Paul says, except for this one cry I shouted out while standing among them, it is about the resurrection of the dead that today I am on trial before you. Look, everything we believe is about the hope of the resurrection. And the hope of the resurrection is not a New Testament idea. It's not an idea that we started believing with the resurrection of Jesus. The hope of the resurrection has always been about the foundation of Jewish faith, that there would one day be a resurrection of the righteous. And Paul's saying, I've done nothing wrong, except that I believe that Yeshua was killed and crucified as an insurrectionist against Rome, which he was not either. But 3 days later, during Passover, he came back to life and will now never die again. The hope of the resurrection today, and even back to the first century, 2,000 years ago, has always been one of the defining beliefs of Jerusalem. The hope of the resurrection is seen in Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac, but then God provided a ram for the sacrifice. The hope of the resurrection is found in all the narratives of the Torah and throughout the prophets, with God's promise to never leave us, the Jewish people, and then sending us into exile for our disobedience, then bringing us back to the land he promised us. Throughout the narrative of Scripture, exile always means death, and return always means resurrection. And Christian commentaries will often say things like, the resurrection is the foundation of Christianity. But far before that, the resurrection was the foundation of Judaism. And even still, the most Orthodox Jews will tell you, from Rambam, from Maimonides, a rabbi in Spain in the 1100s, 1100 years after Paul and Yeshua, who in his 13 tenets of faith, the last one is the hope of the resurrection. See, the real question is, did Yeshua rise from the dead? And we believe the eyewitness accounts in the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, because those who actually saw Yeshua alive after he died all gave their lives rather than recount what they saw with their own eyes. And what's amazing is historically, in the years between 100 and 400 AD or CE, that historically the rabbis just ignore the question altogether, as they ignore the person of Jesus, and they ignore the influence of Jesus, and they're happy to give him over to another religion and blame Paul for creating Christianity, which, by the way, the word Christianity is not used until 60 years after Paul's death in the year 120 by the church father Ignatius, who immediately, as he coins the term Christianity, puts it against Judaism, Judaism being old and Christianity being new. And the early church fathers, beginning with Ignatius in 120, begin to disassociate with Judaism and create a new religion called Christianity, and credit Paul as one who understood that everyone was set free from the Torah, including Jewish people, which Paul gives his life to say that Jewish people should continue to keep the Torah because we believe in everything in Moses and the prophets, which is really the story that Luke tells in the book of Acts. And again, Luke has Paul saying to the Roman governor, to Felix and his Jewish wife, who should know better. He says, "This I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything written in the Torah and the prophets." It's interesting to me that they never called themselves Nazarenes. They never called themselves Christians. Those are names that are given to them and that are used later. But in the first century, we know throughout the book of Acts, they refer to themselves as followers of the way, the followers of Yeshua, the followers who believed in Yeshua, the first fruits of those who had risen from the dead. That he's the way Judaism hoped for, that he's the resurrection from the dead, is the hope of the resurrection that we as a people have always been waiting for. But from the 100s to the 400s, what I found historically is there's really a formation of 2 new religions. Judaism, which has the same name as the Judaism that came before it, is the inheritors of Pharisaic Judaism that began in the first century and rejects Yeshua. And Christianity, which is understood as an anti-Jewish faith, disconnected from the Torah and the prophets, and disconnecting Jewish people from the Torah and the prophets. Because Gentiles were never required to keep all the things that Jewish people were to keep. But instead of letting that be the way that it was and the story that they told, they turn it into something entirely different. But how can you take Paul's words, "I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything written in the Torah and the prophets," and say he didn't? or it was all changed, or he all changed it, or he changed it all. Because our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and everything written in the Torah and the prophet has always included the hope of the resurrection. Paul talks about this in the letter he wrote a few years earlier to the believers in Corinth. He says in explaining the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 14, he says, look, if Messiah has not been raised, then our proclaiming is meaningless, and your faith is also meaningless. Moreover, we would be found to be false witnesses of God because we testified about God that he was raised up Messiah, whom he did not raise up, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then not even Messiah has been raised. And if Messiah has not been raised, then your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. And then those who have already fallen asleep, who have died in Messiah, have perished. And if we have hoped in Messiah in this life alone, we are to be pitied more than all people. But now, Messiah has been raised from the dead, and the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For death came through a man, Adam. The resurrection of the dead also comes through a man, Yeshua. For as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah will all be made alive. It's one of the themes of the entire Bible. From the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation is exile and return. Exile always equals death, and return always equals resurrection. And for those whose faith has died, maybe you're watching and your faith died for some reason, I want to encourage you that it's time for new life. It's time for resurrected life. For those whose faith, you may be watching and your faith was murdered by the actions of others, it's time for new life for you. It's time for the hope of the resurrection. For those whose lives are so messed up that it feels like death, for you, it's time for new life. For those who've been told that believing in Jesus is not Jewish, it's time to put that to death and think of the hope of the resurrection and new life. For those who have been told that you don't need the old, just focus on the new, put that to death. It's time for new life. It's time for the hope of the resurrection. For those who are frustrated by people who don't live what they preach, it's time for new life. For those who are frustrated because you can't seem to live what you preach, it's time for new life. Everything that we believe has always, even before Yeshua, come down to the hope of resurrection. We go into exile because of our sin. God brings us back and gives us new life in resurrection. And the hope of the resurrection was fulfilled in Yeshua's death and resurrection. The testimonies of the four Gospels, which are written by Jewish people, and the book of Acts tells us that Yeshua, from the tribe of Judah in the line of King David, the one who sat under the oak tree at Mamre with our father Abraham, the one who wrestled our father Jacob, the one who spoke face to face with Moses, the one who appeared to Joshua before the battle of Jericho, the one who sat with Gideon under the terebinth tree at Orpah, the one who appeared to Samson's parents, the one who appeared to Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah and Daniel, the same one who appeared in the fiery furnace with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That same God came to earth in human form. He died, rose from the dead 3 days later, all during Passover. He appeared resurrected for 40 days during the days of the Omer to his disciples. He ascended into heaven on the 40th day, and he sent his spirit on the day of Shavuot into the temple courts in Jerusalem so we, Jew and Gentile, could find new life in him. The hope of the resurrection. For Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus, who may be watching, don't stay in exile. Return to the faith of our forefathers and to the hope of the resurrection in Yeshua. For Gentile people that may be watching this, who don't believe in Jesus, don't stay in exile. Return to the God who formed you in your mother's womb and to the hope of the resurrection in Yeshua. You are not destined to stay dead. Your story includes resurrected life. So I implore you, wherever you are in your faith or lack of faith, choose life. Follow Yeshua. Trust in Yeshua, the one who died and rose from the dead. And for those who are watching who've been following Yeshua for a long time and you still find your life in a mess, things didn't work out the way you thought it was going to work out, and there's death all around you, it's okay because Yeshua died and rose from the dead for you too. He did not create you to stay dead in your trespasses, but to find life in his resurrection. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like if someone predicts his own death and resurrection from the dead and then does it, it makes perfect sense to follow that guy. And Yeshua did just that. He predicted his own death. He talked about his own resurrection. And during the festival of Passover, he died, rose from the dead, appeared resurrected during the days of Omer, the 50 days between Passover and Shavuot, ascended into heaven on the 40th day, and gave his spirit, so that in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth among all the Gentiles, he would be known as one who does not leave people in death, but brings us to new life through his resurrection. I can't wait to get into Acts 25 and 26 because Paul continues his battle. He ends up after this speech, Felix leaves him in prison in Caesarea for 2 years. And you remember God said he was going to go preach in Rome, and for those 2 years, Paul must have been thinking to himself, when? Why are you leaving me here? Why am I sitting here for 2 years? Then he has opportunity after sitting in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, which if you come to Israel with us in April, by the way, we would go to Caesarea, I'm going to preach the same messages. Right there, where Paul was in prison waiting, and where he was then sent to Rome because he appeals to Caesar. At first defends himself in front of Agrippa II and his wife, who is also his sister, Bernice. And then is sent to Rome to preach the gospel there, so that you and I could be encouraged that wherever we are and whatever is happening in our lives, that we would understand the death and resurrection of Yeshua and continue to preach the death and resurrection of Yeshua, so that everyone around us who is dead may be brought to new life because of the hope of the resurrection. Lord God, we thank you for who you are and who you've called us to be as your people. We thank you that you sent your son to die and rise from the dead, and that through the hope of the resurrection, you might bring us back to new life, so that we can go and tell others that you don't have to stay where you are. You can find new life in Yeshua as well. We pray these things in Yeshua's awesome and mighty name. Amen. I love you guys. Can't wait to see you next week.